sons, that we pray the prayer you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Jesus.
So I heard about this landlord who was talking about one of his tenants, and he said that the couple living in the suite above him shouts and pounds on the floor until midnight nearly every evening. And he was asked, and when I asked him if he wanted to make a complaint, he said, not really. I'm usually up practicing my trumpet until that time anyway. There's the picture that we're going to be looking at today is one of conflict, of what happens when you have two people who are disagreeing about something. And sometimes it is their fault, sometimes it is our fault, sometimes it is both. Sometimes it's just the things in life create controversy, create problems. And as we read the story of David, the interesting thing is that David's story starts with him being anointed as king. He's going to be the next king. And then he goes out and he defeats Goliath, the challenger to Israel's faith, the challenger to Israel. And you would think at that point, with all that good stuff, I've been chosen, I'm winning battles, then he gets married to the king's daughter, everything is looking up. But from that point forward, and for a long time, everything turns. We saw the start of that last week. As Saul begins to realize that David is a threat, the conflict starts. And last week's, it was kind of a behind-the-scenes thing. Saul doesn't really make his presence known. He doesn't really, everything that he's thinking is, we see it, but the other people don't. But you're starting to see the problems that he has. And he's going to create problems for David. So the interesting thing is, for now, for the rest of the book of Samuel, actually, even though David is at this point fairly close to the king and fairly close to maybe getting God's promise of being king, it's going to start going the opposite direction. David's life is going to get, and it's interesting because he's going to get, right now he's fairly close to the king. I mean, he's just the king's son-in-law, and he's living in the palace. He's even playing music for him when he has problems. But from here on out, David is going to get further and further and further away from that. Now, David could begin to become very discouraged, and I think he does in some ways. But at the same time, he just realized that, well, sometimes even if we're in God's will, even if we're doing exactly what God wants us to do, you would think, well, that means everything would be going great. Actually, sometimes, maybe many times, even when we're doing what God wants us to do, even when we're close to where we think God wants us to be, the conflicts begin. So we're going to turn to 1 Samuel 18. We're going to read the last couple verses from what we talked about last week. And then we're going to go into chapter 19 and talk about this whole process and how the conflict between Saul and David is going to start intensifying. It's going to start ratcheting up. And it's going to become public. And so here in verse 28 of 1 Samuel 18, it says, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David, probably could stop right there. I could preach a whole sermon just on that. You realize that sometimes people are going to look at you and they're going to realize that God is with you. And they're going to think, wow, that's great. This is great that God is with you. And no, they're not. Because this is what he does. And that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Saul sees that God is with David, but he doesn't accept that. Instead, he becomes David's enemy forever. That's kind of a harsh thing, right? Thinking about that. Verse 30 then says, the Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. David's still succeeding. There's still conflict. It's not like the Philistines said, oh, David beat Goliath, so I guess we'll just go back in our towns and we'll just hide from. No, they keep going out to battle, it says. So the wars keep going on. David has conflict with Saul. David has conflict with the Philistines. Everything is, he gets up every day and has a problem. Right? That's what and I know none of you can identify with that, because we all live a perfect life, never have any problems, and always goes smooth in there. Chapter 19, verse 1. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. Up till now, if you look back in chapter 18, the interesting thing is a lot of what Saul's thinking is we're aware of it, but he doesn't make it public. He says, well, I'm going to send David out to do battle. Why? Because I'm kind of hoping that the Philistines are going to kill him, right? But he doesn't say it to people. He just does that. He gets his wife. He wants his daughter to marry David, and what does he do? He gives David a job and says, if you want to marry my daughter, this is what you got to do. You got to kill 100 Philistines. Because he thinks, well, the Philistines will kill David, and my problem. But it's all inner. But now, as we get into chapter 19, it becomes public. David says, by the way, kill David. You can't say it any clearer than that, right? You can't state it any clearer. When we say that Saul is David's enemy, he's coming out into public now and he's saying, David must die. Okay? There's no doubt on which side David is and which side Saul is. Except that, as we're going to see, there's some bugs in Saul's family, right? In the second part of chapter 9, second part of verse 1, it says, but Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning, go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you, and I will tell you what I find out. So Jonathan says, okay, I like David, I'm friends with David, we're becoming buddies here, but my dad is the king. And so I can't just go against that. So I'm going to be a reconciler here. I'm going to stand between you and Saul, David. I'm going to try to work this out. In verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. Saul changes his mind. Wow, I'm glad that problem was solved. You ever do that anytime? Get between two people that are having a debate? Sometimes it happens in your families, I know. Sometimes maybe it's two friends. And you think, I'm just going to go talk to one and then talk to the other, and I'll bring them together, and I'll list all the reasons and the facts and all these things, and we'll just very calmly and rationally talk about this, and then the problem will be solved. Because everybody will see what's going on, and everybody will say, yes, I'm glad, and the peace will just break out everywhere, as they say. Yes, it happens. How many of you have ever had that experience? How come my hand is the only one up? Because you know what's going to happen next, right? Right. You know what's going to happen next. This is the thing about conflict. Well, we're going to read let me read the next couple of verses. Verse 7. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. It's all good. Once more, war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. Seems like a good thing, right?
Right.
Seems like a good thing, except that this is the pattern that has been kind of established. Even back in the previous chapter, it talks about Jonathan and David becoming friends. And then it talks about how when David comes back with the armies after defeat, remember the people sing this little song about Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed 10,000s. And Saul just appreciates that all the way down to his bones. He just thinks that's the best thing ever.
Not.
So the interesting thing here is that David's success, you would think, it's good for Israel, so you would think the king would be happy about that. But we're going to see that that's not, strictly speaking, what goes on here. Verse 9, it says, "But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape." You know, in the past, I've always read this and thought, this is Saul, and I think the previous time he does this, it talks about him, throwing it at him. But this is not that. This is Saul's got the spear in his hand, and he charges David, and he tries to runs David right through and stick him to the wall. So let me just read back all the way back to verse 6. 3 verses before that, Saul says, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." As soon as David wins a few battles, Saul forgets all of that, picks up his spear, and goes after David. This is the beginning of the end for Saul and David. Because David is going to have to run. And now, it's not going to be, there's not going to be any reconciliation. This evil spirit that comes on Saul. Last Wednesday night we talked about this quite a bit, about this evil spirit comes, and we're always a little uncomfortable because it says it's from the Lord. So what's this, why is Saul doing this, and how is God responsible for it? And I don't know that we can say that necessarily that God is responsible for it, but what God does is, he says, I'm going to show all of you who Saul actually is. When I rejected Saul for being king, this is what I was talking about, God says. This is the kind of behavior that you can expect from Saul. And he is going to continue to do this until the day he dies. We're only in chapter 19 of Samuel, and there's 30 chapters. So for the next 10 chapters, Saul's going to try to kill David. But the interesting thing is that as David lives this life, well, first of all, before I go too much further, let me just remind everybody that conflict is rarely solved by giving facts or reasons. The first thing that happens is Jonathan says, look, my dad's a reasonable guy. All I got to do is go talk to him and explain the way things are, and he'll see the problem, and he'll fix it, and everything will be fine. Now, we have to be careful here, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. What I'm saying is, I know for a fact, and I have very good reasons to believe that in situations like this, people don't really listen to facts or reasons. And now when I say people, I'm including myself in that too. Because it's usually feelings, emotions, there's a lot going on here. And this happens, by the way, in churches. Does that come as a surprise to you? I've been in churches that have had splits. You've been in churches that have had splits. You know that here's Christians, here's people who all love Jesus, but they can't get along. And it's not because people don't understand the situation. It's not because they don't know the reasons or the facts or have but it's because we have the things we hold dearly and we are attached to, and nothing's going to persuade us to go differently. Yes, I agree, you're right, but I'm still going to do this because I have these other reasons why this right. And this is what's happening, by the way, in our country. Both sides have reasons for what they want to believe or what they want to do, and neither side is going to budge from there, no matter how much you talk to them. We think that if I could just sit down with you and explain this, you would see my opinion. And people say, I see your opinion, and I'm raising my opinion over your opinion, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Now, when I wanted to put this up here because, in one sense, this isn't really the main point of all this story, but the conflict is kind of a sub-thing that goes on. It's going to go on. Saul's not going to ever listen again to anybody about David. No matter what they say, he's not going to hear it. And so, but that doesn't mean, and this is what I want to emphasize, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do that. We just need to realize that the only thing that's going to change Saul is for a good spirit to come from God and change Saul's heart and mind. And just to give you a little blurb about the end, the good spirit is going to come from God. And guess what? Saul doesn't change. So that just complicates things, doesn't it? I have to think about that for a minute, Lord, and keep reading. So, verse 11. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. By the way, that's one of those pictures that you read, and if you're a Bible student, you realize that there's 2 or 3 other stories that are very similar. A woman lets a guy down out of a window, and the guy gets away. It's something that happens. I always say when you're reading these stories, just kind of watch for those, because they happen. It happens to Paul. It happens to the spies in Jericho. It happens in various places. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. Because anybody who's ever watched TV or a movie knows that's how you disguise it. You put a pillow or you put something in the bed, put a little hair up at the top, and anybody who looks at the bed will say, well, obviously there's something in the bed. We just could. Now, one of the things that I'm going to stop, because it kind of runs right past it, but it talks about this idol. Where did this idol come from? Yeah. This is David's house, right? How come David has an idol in the house? I don't know. Here's my guess. Oh, look, first let me just say this. There's a word for idol here. And you're going to get your Hebrew lesson for today. It's the word is teraphim. Teraphim. The I am at the end means it's plural. So it means gods, actually. So it really says, took a god, the gods, and placed them in the bed. The other thing is that there's only one other place where this word really becomes part of the story. And it's interesting to see the comparisons. There's a story back in Genesis. The guy's name is Jacob. You ever heard of Jacob? Well, maybe you heard his other name, which is Israel. He's the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Jacob he's running away from his family too. His brother, Esau, is a little upset with him because he stole the birthright, remember that? So he runs to his uncle's place in a different country. There, he falls in love with a woman named Rachel. And then his uncle Laban pulls a fast one on him and has him marry his other daughter, Leah, first, and then gets to marry Rachel. Are you remembering this story? Remember, there's 2 daughters. How many daughters were in this story? 2, and he marries the younger one. Jacob marries Leah and Rachel. Then, at that point, Jacob's had enough of Uncle Laban, and goes back to Israel, where his father is, right? Rachel, the wife, steals the family teraphim, the idols. And that's why they get into trouble with Uncle Laban later. These teraphim are apparently what a lot of times the phrase is household gods. Back in those days, we don't really do that here, but in a lot of places around the world they do. In your house, you would have a little shrine or like an altar where you would put things from your family. And they would be idols. Sometimes sometimes it's ancestor worship, or sometimes it's other. But you have this little shrine, and you have these little trinkets and things in there. And those are the teraphim. Now, usually they're pretty small, but this one apparently is big. Big enough that it looks like a body in a bed. And what we can do then is we compare the two stories, because we're using the same word, and the idol is probably something that Michal has, not something that David has. They've just been married a short period of time, probably. Remember, just got married in the last chapter. So Michal takes her own idols and puts them in this bed to deceive her parents, or father specifically. So you got this whole picture where, and I'm tempted to go, we're going to talk about Michal later on in some other stories, but one of the things that I want to kind of point out here is that I'm not sure that Michal is doing what she does because she's trying to be faithful to God. It says several times that she does this because she loves David. So she's doing it out of her care for David, but she doesn't have the faith that David has. Later on, Michal and David are going to have some big problems over this. I don't know if well, it's actually in 2 Samuel, so it'll probably be a while before we get there. There's this whole scene where David is bringing the ark to Jerusalem, and he's getting kind of crazy. He's dancing in the streets, and he's doing some stuff. I mean, he's really showing his love for God, and he's doing it in a pretty, exuberant kind of. Some of us would probably say, yeah, he's kind of Pentecostal doing this dancing and stuff. And yeah, careful, I know. But Michal has a big problem with it. And then David says, but I love God, and I'm just showing that love and praise for God. And then it says that Michal doesn't have any children through this, and so you can kind of see that stuff. So I think that when we read here about Michal, we're seeing here is not necessarily a person who has the same faith that David has, but a person who is at this point in time helping David. I mean, she is her husband, or he is her husband. So she's doing this. So, verse 14 says, when Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, he is ill. Which I stopped there this week and I'm thinking, they're sent to kill him, right? What difference does it make if you kill him? I mean, so what, right? Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. So Saul has the same attitude. He's like, look, I understand he's ill, but it doesn't matter because we're just going to chop his head off anyway. So what's going on here? But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Michal told him, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? So Michal says, well, it's not my fault. David threatened me. He said I had to do this or he would kill me. So Michal, in the span of 3 verses, tells 2 lies and is not necessarily demonstrating a lot of character qualities in her own life. But she does help David get away. And I was thinking about this in terms of conflict. Not only is it true that conflict is rarely solved by giving facts or reasons, but conflict increases because people are forced to take sides. And it's not necessarily all for the right reasons. Jonathan is starting to take David's side. Michal is starting to take David's side. As we read through the story, we're going to see more and more people either join Saul or join David, and you have a civil war almost that's going to go on as we go on through these things. So David has the promises of God, and through the promises of God, in order to, the whole country is going to be divided. See, you thought that just happened here in our country. Yeah. But it happens all the time. It happens in families, it happens in churches, it happens in... Why? Because you don't get a choice. You're going to choose one side or the other. Like to believe that we can just sit in the middle and never lean one way or the other, but you can't. You're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to choose. Pick one or the other, because that's the way it's going to be. This whole family is being divided by what's going on between Saul and David. It always starts with two people, and then eventually everybody is forced into a situation where you have to choose one or the other. And so, we get to the last part of this chapter, which in some ways is the most interesting part. This is what happens, starting to, well, there's, actually, I'm going to read this, this little poem I have. I've had this poem for a long time, and it's called Grandma Says. And it says, when the folks next to you act like those in the zoo, a grumbling, growlin, and spittin, it's a pretty good plan to be calm as you can and do something useful, like knittin. When a gossiping woman with poison-barbed tongue comes into the room where you're sitting and starts to defame some neighbor's good name, count stitches out loud and keeps knitting. When there's been a slight misunderstanding at church and others hint broadly of quitting, why, the very best thing you can do is to sing, stay at your post, and keep knitting. When Satan moves in with his cohorts of sin, say, you'll never find me submitting. You irk me, I find, so get thee behind, and please don't disturb me. I'm knitting. In the middle of problems, the big ones and small, it's always most proper and fitting to trust and to pray till the Lord shows the way, and go right ahead with your knitting. That's the goal. But sometimes, or I think most times, that's a little bit like I just said. You can knit all you want, but at some point, you're going to have to set the knit down and choose sides. It's pretty hard to stay neutral in this situation, any situation. But you got to try. You got to try to reason with people. You got to try to, but realize that a lot of times you're going to be forced into that situation where you're going to have to choose. You're going to have to choose sides. Verse 18. So, when David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. We haven't seen Samuel for a long time, but Samuel's still around. He's still the prophet down at Ramah, and he's still living there. Everybody knows where he's at. We don't see much from him, but here he is. And why does David go there? Well, he anointed David as king. He started all this, you could argue. And so David runs to him, and he explains it all. And then we're gonna say, well, Samuel probably told David, gave him all this advice and all this stuff. But apparently, Samuel doesn't do anything. Look at verse 19. Word came to Saul. Oh, wait a minute. Did I read that whole sentence?
No.
I did not. And told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Naioth here's a little biblical translation issue. Naioth is one of those words where we're not sure it's capitalized as a place name here, a proper name. But Naioth actually means something like the campground. And so it could be that when they're using this word, they're describing this place where the prophets gather. Because we're going to see Naioth about 5 times in the next 6 verses. It's always Naioth at Ramah. So it's just an interesting thing to see it that way. Is it a place name, or is it just a description of a place? I know that really thrills you, and you're thinking, wow, the pastor could have probably left that out and it wouldn't have mattered at all to the story. But I think it's important for us to see that what we're talking about here is a place that's known to people, but it's probably not called, and Naoth as a place. It's just a description of the place. So word came to Saul. How did word come to Saul? Because people are being forced to take sides, and somebody is telling Saul where David is. David is in Naoth at Ramah. So Saul sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they also prophesied. What's going on here? Saul sends these guys, they're going to arrest David, and instead they join in with all the prophesying going on. Prophesying in this context then is a direct utterance that comes from a spiritual source. That's what word prophecy means here. And so as they're all gathering together, they're all speaking words from God or from somewhere. The word prophecy is neutral. This says the Spirit of God came on Saul's men and they prophesied. So you can kind of imagine that. He sends a crew of men to get David, and there's 10 people, and then they're prophesying, so he sends 10 more, and they're prophesying. Pretty soon you've got a pretty good-sized church going on right there, right? Lots of prophesying going on. And you think, okay, so what's going on with all this prophesying going on in the Spirit of God? Let's read the next verse. Finally, Saul himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Sikhu, and he asked, "Where are Samuel and David?" "Over in Naoth at Ramah," they said. So Saul went to Naoth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naoth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. This is why people say, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" That is just an odd situation. I mean, knowing everything that we've said about Saul for the last few chapters, there's an evil spirit from God coming on Saul, and now here's the Spirit of God coming on Saul, and he's prophesying. But he's prophesying in a very odd, weird way. I mean, he's taking his clothes off. That's, when I prophesy, I almost never do that. Right? And if I did, I'm pretty sure that y'all would have a problem with that. But it also says that Samuel's there. So we can't assume that Samuel would be there if there wasn't some real Spirit of God thing going on, right? He knows what God sounds like. He's been talking to God since he was a kid. So he knows what. So Saul's, and you just kind of scratch your head and go, what is going on here? One of the things that's going on is, symbolically, we talked about this a little bit last week. Remember Jonathan meets David, and what does Jonathan do? He takes his clothes and he gives them to David, symbolically taking off his king outfit and giving it to David. Okay, well now we've got Saul removing clothes. So what's he doing? Well, symbolically, he's recognizing that he's not king anymore, or not the rightful king anymore. He knows it, and that's why he's now, when he does this, I'm not sure that Saul's actually thinking it, but he subconsciously knows that he's not the rightful king anymore. He knows that Samuel has told him that God's going to take the kingship from you. So he knows that it's not really his anymore. And I think that's what's going on here. Now, go back to point number one. Will facts and reasons change his mind? No. Because he's going to get up, put the clothes back on, and go back to doing what he was doing before. But even Saul at this point, through the Spirit of God, is being shown and is showing that he recognizes what God is doing here. God is going to take the kingship from him and give it to David. Subconsciously knows that. Down deep inside, he knows that's the truth. But he's going to fight against it for the rest of his life. And this is one of the things that happens with conflict, is that you have these situations that show that even if we knew, and even when we know the right way to go, a lot of times we choose not to. A lot of times we choose not to. So our behavior in conflict reveals our character, either good or bad. Saul knows what the truth is here, but he's not going to go with it. He has rejected God as thoroughly as God has rejected him. This is one of the things that happens. We talk about predestination. You ever heard the word predestination before? It's the idea that God chooses, right? Him and her, or not him and not her, or what. But the reality is, when we talk about predestination, that's true. God does make these choices, but that doesn't mean that we don't make choices. And that's the problem that a lot of times we face. We think it's either God makes a choice or I make a choice, when actually it's both. I'm just as likely to reject God as God is to reject me. In fact, that's one of the ways that we know. How do we know that anyone in this room is chosen by God? And the answer is because you chose God. God chose you. How do we know? Because you chose God. God has rejected you. How do we know? Because you rejected God. It works both ways. Saul, I've been kind of implying this and maybe even stating it out right out, but Saul and David both start from the same place, and they both receive gifts from God. They both have, but David's a man after God's own heart because David wants what God is offering. Saul doesn't. And this happens too, and we all know people like that. We know people that we grew up with who had all the same spiritual benefits that you've got, but they don't follow God, and you do. Or they follow God, and you don't. Either way, that's this whole process is a way of that God reveals who we are. Conflict does that. Who are you? Well, it's best seen when times of stress, in times of tension, in times of conflict. One of the last things that I want to talk about here as we go back through this is, and it's something I haven't talked about much, but David is the king, and when Jesus comes, he's going to be called the Son of David. And the picture then of Jesus is that he's going to be the king who is in the line of David. He's going to be like David in some ways. Here's where we're going to flip this around a little bit and say that David is actually going to be like Christ a little bit. So when we read these stories, we want to look for those patterns too. Where is David doing things or saying things that Jesus would later do something similar or something like that? But since Jesus is the Son of God, we'd also see it reflected back the other way. As the ultimate human being, Jesus would do things, and we would be looking for David to be doing those kinds. So it's kind of like Jesus copies David, but David copies Jesus. Isn't that weird? Mm-hmm. Yes, it is weird. It's okay to agree with it. The pastor can say it's weird, and you can say yes, and it's okay. Because that's kind of that function. So being in God's will does not mean there will be no conflict. Okay, so there's going to be conflict. Go back to the previous point that I made. Behavior in conflict reveals our character, good or bad. Look at when there's conflict in Jesus' life, there's persecution, just like David is facing. Peter says this about Jesus. This is in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20. And he says, "But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." You know what's interesting about this whole last chapter? David doesn't say anything. The only thing David does is he leaves. It's all the other people saying things. David did not retaliate. David made no threats. David doesn't do anything to make matters worse. All he does is leave. David is doing exactly what Peter said Jesus did. And Jesus did exactly what David did. How is it commendable when you're in a conflict and then you do something wrong and suffer for it in that conflict? That's on you. Because what are we supposed to be? We're supposed to be like Christ, even in conflict. Even when the other side is being unfair. Even when the other side won't listen to reason. Even when we're forced to take sides. We still have to be like Christ. Whatever else happens, we have to be like Christ.
Thank you.
Let's pray.